Hello, and welcome to American University's policy series on climate change and communities, lessons from some of the world's most vulnerable. My name is John Reeder, and I'm part of AU's Center for Environmental Policy. This is the first in a webinar series titled A New Coast, Strategies for Responding to Devastating Storms and Rising Seas, featuring the author of a book by that same title, Jeffrey Peterson. We have about 200 participants from across the country today. Many of them are American University students. Thank you all for joining. Two bits of housekeeping before we begin. First, once we get rolling, you may submit questions for our speakers using the question feature on your screen. We will take as many questions as time allows. Second, we are planning this webinar for 90 minutes. That means we should finish around 4:30 Eastern Time, not 4 o'clock. We hope you can stay for the full time, and we'll finish promptly at 4:30. Today's webinar is co-sponsored by our good friends at the Georgetown University's Climate Center, and Lisa Ann Hamilton, the Director of Adaptation Programs at the Center, is joining our panel today. Thank you, Lisa, for co-sponsoring this event. Richard Innes, Senior Fellow at the Meridian Institute, will also join us. He is also extensively involved with the Joint Oceans Commission initiative to catalyze ocean policy reform and action, and also helps direct the work of the National Estuary Programs. We are honored today to have as our moderator, Mr. Robert Perciasepe, former Secretary for the Environment for Maryland, former acting EPA Administrator, former EPA Deputy Administrator, former Assistant Administrator for Water, and former Assistant Administrator for Air. Those are all separate positions. They are all Senate confirmed positions. He is now the Director of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, C2ES. Thank you, Bob, for serving as moderator today. Before I turn it over to Mr. Perciasepe, I'd like to introduce our lead speaker. He serves as a US Senator from Rhode Island. If you work in the environmental policy arena, he scarcely needs an introduction. He's a champion of environmental policy in Congress and perhaps among a dwindling breed of thoughtful leaders in the Senate who take science seriously and has made informed policymaking a hallmark of his work. He is also a member of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, as well as the Judiciary Committee, which, as we all know, is extremely busy now with a possible confirmation process for a Supreme Court justice. I give you Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And big plaudits to Bob Perciasepe and Jeff Peterson for their longtime service in our EPA back when it was genuinely interested in environmental protection. And Rich Innes, who served early on in EPA and then came to EPW, my committee. So it's great to be with you guys, and I appreciate it. I would like to make 2 points. One is that with respect to oceans and coasts, despite the bitter partisanship of much of Congress, we're actually making steady, good, solid progress. We got the first ocean plastics bill passed by unanimous consent. The Senate passed a bigger, better, stronger plastics bill by unanimous consent, which is awaiting action in the House. On funding, my Oceans and Coast Fund is up and funded, and we hope to plow more money into it. We have just had a hearing in the Energy Committee on an offshore funding bill to take the revenues from offshore wind and treat them like oil and gas revenues, bring them back to states, and instead of Land and Water Conservation Fund, to coastal conservation uses. And we had a hearing in the Appropriations Committee where the chair and the ranking member promised that in the next appropriations bill, they would do a big ocean plastic fund for the government. We also have our Blue Globe bill about data, which is out of the Commerce Committee and awaiting floor action. We have bipartisan estuaries reauthorization, bipartisan blue carbon working its way through Commerce, a carbon capture bill for the oceans. We have the Ocean Acidification Act, bipartisan in the Senate. And in the National Defense Authorization Act, we've got a suite of 3 illegal fishing bills and the Sea Fuel Act, which is an innovation in alternative fuels. So that's actually quite a lot that is going on, and almost all of it happens virtually unanimously. So there's something about oceans that seems to bring out the best in us, even in our most partisan and divided selves. And all of that is great, but the two big things that are clobbering our oceans are warming and associated sea level rise, of course, and acidification. And those two are unavoidable consequences of carbon emissions, and it's the climate change of the oceans. And we've been unable to make much progress on that, largely because the fossil fuel industry runs a massive, massive obstruction and denial campaign. Even while fossil fuel CEOs are joining things like the Business Roundtable, issuing a statement saying that they know we need to do something about climate change and support a carbon price, their operation, their front groups, their political dollars are all going to oppose the very things that they claim to support. So maybe that's just double dealing and two-facedness, or maybe that's transition, too early to tell. But what people need to know is that despite what you may hear out of the industry, the climate denial and obstruction operation is still running at full bore. And at the same time, the rest of corporate America is sitting on its hands and doing exactly nothing in Congress. Even the ones with the best climate records for sustainability within their corporate precincts don't bother to show up or lift a finger on climate in Congress. And many of them, the good guys, actually support trade associations that then come to Congress and are climate opponents. So if you did like a net analysis of corporate America, they would be, as a group, staunchly against climate action, even if you took out the fossil fuel industry and all of its mischief. And that needs to change. And I think it is beginning to change. And when it changes, you will then see the proverbial sea change in the Senate and in the House, and that cannot come too soon. So that's my political overview, my view of the political ecosystem around me from your favorite field observer of the Senate.
Thank you, Senator. Senator, climate denialism, which you just talked about, some people believe it's sort of rooted in a fear of solutions, that if the solutions weren't so scary, perhaps people would find a way around their denial. And I'm wondering if you see that changing at all, because we hear a lot about how the solutions could actually help energize, no pun intended, the economy, perhaps energize it in a different way. But do you see that attitudes changing as people become more familiar with some of the solutions that you've been talking about?
Yeah, I think the problem has been on the Republican side, obviously. We could do a climate bill tomorrow among Democrats. And on the Republican side, you have a fossil fuel industry that has been extremely politically engaged, particularly since the Citizens United decision, which gave them basically tactical nukes politically when they used to have like muskets. And they went to the Republican Party and said, game's over, you're ours, we want no dissent. Anybody who crosses us, will hang on a lamppost for everybody else to see. And they did with Bob Inglis, for example. So that has been a problem. And they have an obvious fear about the effect of climate solutions on their industry. They've tried to create an imaginary fear about climate solution economic drawdowns or harms in the larger economy. That's, I think, always been fake, but they've done a pretty good job of propagating that form of climate denial. And what we're seeing right now is that people are becoming increasingly aware, particularly in Wall Street, in ag, in the big finance companies, that doing nothing is probably the worst possible outcome. You got that Stanford report talking about a $23 trillion hit. You've got the recent Commodities Futures Trading Committee report with a very urgent, dire warning. You've got people talking about systemic risk that sweeps across the global economy. And it's many and serious warnings. And so that's starting to to sink in and overcome that sort of pathology that if we do something, it will cost us. No, it's if we do nothing, it will cost us. As a matter of fact, if we do something, it will actually help us entirely apart from the avoided harm. And so that brings it back to the fossil fuel industry. And even there, I think there's a gradually emerging tendril of thought that a carbon price actually is their best survival strategy because it makes things real. It gives revenues that can help support their transition. It allows plants to operate longer if their emissions are offset than if they're just polluting unrestrained. And so if you're looking at the difference between going out the airplane door with or without a parachute, now that they're looking at the airplane door and realizing that things are pretty bleak for them, particularly in COVID, the parachute's starting to look a little bit better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Senator. I'd like to ask or remind the audience that you may submit questions for the Senator using the Q&A feature on your screen. Meanwhile, I didn't want to engage you in too much political prognostication, Senator, but is it your sense that we might see a burst of legislative activity on the environment should the Senate change hands come November?
Undoubtedly.
So what do you see as coming up?
We would move rapidly towards a comprehensive climate bill.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question from participants. This one from a student at American University. Senator Whitehouse, what has been the largest obstacle to passing climate change legislation?
Dark money.
That's a pretty quick answer.
Yep, dark money. That's it. I was elected to the Senate in 06. I was sworn in 07. And for all of 07, 08, and 09, we had bipartisan bills kicking around the Senate. In 2008, the Republican nominee for president ran with a very respectable climate platform. And in January of 2010, the Citizens United decision came down. And instantly to that, I mean, literally instantly, from that day forward, January, whatever it was, 20th, 2010, from that day forward, no Republican got on any serious climate bill. And it was because the fossil fuel industry suddenly had tactical nukes instead of just musketry to try to impose its will on the Republican Party. And it took them about one day to figure out how to not only have unlimited money to spend in politics, but how to hide that it was them doing it. So it goes through phony front groups with names like Americans for Peace and Puppies and Prosperity and Joy. And, you know, it goes through Donors Trust, which is just an identity laundering machine set up for this very purpose. It goes through front groups with silly names like Heartland Institute and Competitive Enterprise Institute, all these like good sounding things. And it's just a poisonous array of denial groups that are all put up to propagate lies. But it allows the fossil fuel industry to hide and avoid accountability for what it's doing. If you could follow the money and show who was behind all this stuff, it would clean itself up in about 2 months.
Bob, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in there. I have other questions I can take, or our moderator, Bob Perciasepe, is waiting in the wings to take over as well.
Well, John, you're doing such a great job of looking at the questions. You know, why don't you
keep going?
Keep going.
All right. We have a question from a Miss Moser, and her question is, what do you think are the greatest threats to environmental legislation if the Supreme Court goes to 6-3? Wonderful to hear you again. The last part is not a question.
Yeah, well, Justice Ginsburg made Massachusetts versus EPA 5-4. And if you read the dissenting views in that, they really don't stand up very well to what we've learned since then. And there's been a big shift with the rest of corporate America starting to come on board and realize, oops, we've got a real business model problem here with climate change now. It's not just public relations any longer. So the signals that come into the court might shift. The US Chamber of Commerce is a very prevalent filer of briefs, either as a party or as an amicus. and they are a very strong signaler to the right-wing judges of what to do, and they get obeyed a lot. So if, let's just say, the Chamber of Commerce was to say, holy crap, our members are terrified about what's going to really happen if we don't get ahead of this, we're changing our position, we want something done on climate, then there's less to worry about in terms of 6-3 decisions. But it's a real danger that you have a group of judges who are so responsive to secretive big money interests, and there's such a swarm, like a mosquito swarm of phony front groups flying around, buzzing around the court all the time, dropping in their little doses of poison.
Thank you. We don't often get to speak with a senator, so this is our chance to find out what the sense of Congress is, at least sense of the Senate. And one of our questions is, what is the Democrats' appetite for a fee on carbon or other carbon pricing schemes?
The Senate climate report was very much built around the notion of a price on carbon. And my take is that if we go forward, we need to go forward looking at a bipartisan bill, because it will be more durable and less amenable to political abuse and misuse. But we can't allow Republicans to pretend to be part of that bipartisan process, but actually be spoilers. So we also have to have a bill that if we have to go forward with it on Democrats alone, we've got that ready to go as well. And we have to have a schedule, and we have to challenge whoever is doing it to say, look, by this date, we're going to bring a bill to the floor. And if you've got a bipartisan bill ready that hits the 1.5 or 2 degree bogey, and it's convincing, and you can show me where you got the votes, we'll go with it, because bipartisan is better than partisan in terms of durability. But if not, if you're jerking us around, if you're slow walking us, if you're just playing along to be a spoiler, forget about it. By that date, we're going to go with our all Democrats bill, and it's going to be really, really, really robust. And then you have to make sure both avenues go forward. That, I think, is the path to a very strong climate bill rapidly, ideally with bipartisanship. And the bipartisanship one would clearly have a carbon price in the middle of it, because it's the only idea that the Republicans have come up with by way of a solution.
Thank you. Senator, a number of us are former EPA, and there are a couple former EPA organizations that have focused a lot on the institutions of government, and especially EPA. Yeah. And there's a lot of concern about harm that may have come to the institutions over the last few years. Is this a matter that you or your colleagues have given some thought to, especially on EPW, Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, about what we need to do to restore the institutions that we feel are so important, especially for environmental protection?
Yeah, and I also want to thank the EPA staff and alumni who have been so helpful to us, both in our regulatory and in our investigative activities. We've been able to stop some really bad things, and we've been able to put the skids under some really slippery people and get them out of the building, with much thanks to EPA staff and alumni, whistleblowers. I think that in a new administration, we've got to focus on cleaning the place up. I think we probably need the president to have the mother of all executive orders on his desk the day he's sworn in. So we're going to have to work really hard to make sure that people have resigned that are supposed to resign, and if not, they're fired. And to make sure that people who've burrowed into the civil infrastructure are sent to where they deserve to be, and wherever, far off the beaten track and where they can't be troublemakers. And that executive orders are reversed, and that administrative actions are stopped or restarted, and that pleadings are withdrawn, that we just clear the decks early on, right away, so that we can then go on to have an administration that isn't tied down like, Gulliver by the Lilliputians with 1,000 threads of nuisance and interference from people that we haven't bothered to yet clear out. And I also think we need to set up a commission with investigative powers, with subpoena powers, with the ability to refer cases to prosecutors, to look through all of the corruption that took place within federal agencies during the Trump administration, so that if you are an employee who weathered this ghastly period and you've got notes and memories of awful stuff that was done around you, and you haven't wanted to stick your head up now, not knowing how that ended, particularly with Bill Barr over at the Department of Justice. In a clean administration with a clean Department of Justice, you might want to go tell your story to somebody, and there has to be a someplace for you to go to. And I think a commission to study the corruption of the federal agencies during the Trump administration with full investigative and subpoena powers and the ability to make those kind of referrals would be a very helpful thing. And then it gets it off the plate of the new EPA administrator, who can worry about what they're supposed to be worried about, which is policy and improving the environment, rather than having to deal with employees who have, you know, post-Trump corruption stress disorder.
Right. Senator, I know that you have a lot of Senate business today. I wanted to take, if you have a moment, one more question from our panelists. Do we have anybody from our panel who's got a question they'd like to pose for the senator before we release him for his Senate duties?
I'll ask a good question, sort of a transition question, because I think you've covered the political landscape, as painful as it is, but as potentially positive as it is, as you pointed out, on some of the bipartisan work. You know, I remember, Senator, spending some time in the Warwick, Rhode Island sewage treatment plant with you.
It had gotten flooded.
It had gotten flooded, you know, record floods. My memory serves me well. It was 16 inches of rain in an hour, a couple hours. But that, when we're talking about Jeff's book and resilience and the planning for resilience, obviously Providence and all the towns around Narragansett Bay are focused on this. And that sewage treatment plant for me always was, you know, a decade ago, of how you might approach rebuilding so that it's going to be less vulnerable the next time, which the next time is going to come. And so, you know, there's a number of questions in our queue here about ocean marine protection areas, other coastal issues, recognizing we're going to have some impacts from climate change, even if we can turn the ship around today. You know, give us some of the thoughts on how, you know, you mentioned some at the beginning, but on, you know, what kind of federal programs we ought to be thinking about to be more focused on these issues.
Well, I think, you know, dramatically expanded marine protected areas is a good place to start, but you have to have enforcement for that. Otherwise, it's not real. So you've got to have that as well. We're going to have to do a lot of infrastructure work along our coasts to address climbing seas. The Warwick sewage treatment plant blew out because of a river flood, because of a pocket storm, a rain surge. But across the bay is Bristol and Warren, and they have a seaside sewage treatment plant that is going to be flooded, and they're already having to plan for, where do I put it? And how do I build the pumping since I'm not getting gravity feed any longer? And how do we make all this work? And it's a real chore for a small town. And wherever the land meets the sea, they're going to be facing those tasks and those chores. And so we absolutely have to get after climate change and solve it, because otherwise we're just continuing to make these problems worse and worse and worse. But even if we did a perfect bill tomorrow, you'd see things worsen for a decade before it started to turn around. And we've got to get these communities through that decade. And when you got Moody's going to coastal communities and saying, hey, we're going to have to rethink your municipal bonds because of the storm and flood and sea level rise stress on your finances, that's a pretty strong signal that the markets are starting to react already. So I think that's going to be really important. And a small town in Texas that can't afford what it needs to do is going to be yelling at their senators saying, damn it, help me. And that will, I think, help change the dynamic a little bit on those kind of bills.
Thanks. John.
All right. Well, thank you, Senator.
We built a reverse moat around we built a wall, a dirt wall around the Warwick thing to keep the water out. Very primitive technology.
We elevated all the electric pumps and everything else. It was an interesting project.
Well, Senator, thank you so much for joining us. We all very much appreciate your work for the environment. If I could open it up so you could hear all 200 people clapping, I would, but I think you're gonna.
Well, let me thank you for all your great work. Let me thank Jeff Peterson for his wonderful book. And let me ask all EPA formers to think about what that Biden opening day executive order needs to have in it to give a really clean start for the new EPA administrator and clear out the rot as rapidly as possible. Thank you all.
Thank you. Very good thoughts. Okay. Mr. Perciasepe, we are moving on to the rest of the program, and I'm going to turn the reins over to you. Thank you.
All right. Well, John, you did a great job fishing through some of the questions. We had, I think, almost 20 questions, so there's a lot that haven't been answered by the senator, but many that will actually be touched on in the presentation that Jeff's going to give, and then the conversation we're going to have with the panelists, which will be more of a conversation after we're done. I think that what we heard just now, and I think one of the foundational issues we have here is that no matter what we do on the mitigation of climate change side, we're already facing the challenge of climate change. We're already facing some of the impacts. So we're, for the second time in history, we're down into alpha beta on the names of tropical storms. We have fires, probably the most extensive fires in at least in the history that we've had in California and some of the other Western states. This is almost an annual occurrence. And our coastal impacts. One of the sunny day flooding is becoming more and more prevalent, and so we obviously have transitions that we have to go through, both in terms of how to mitigate climate, but also transitions in how we live. I believe there was an article in the New York Times just in the last week or so about migration inside the United States related to climate impacts that are coming. And so the question really, one of the key questions is this transition, whether it's the lower carbon economy, but also our adaptation and development of resilience to the impacts of climate change, is this transition going to happen in an orderly way, or is it going to be in a disruptive way? And I think what we'll hear from Jeff and his work on his book is that we know some of the things that need to get done, and we know how we should probably be preparing for that more orderly transition, how to work with the private sector, what kinds of federal laws and federal programs need to be looked at. And I think, as the senator mentioned at the very end, that Moody's, for those of you who don't know, is a bond rating agency. There's also Standard & Poor's and several others. All of them are hiring people to help them understand climate risk. And it's only a matter of time before that starts to affect the ability of municipalities who can't deal with the risk from being further impacted by financial impact. So the economic viability of regions, the economic competitiveness of regions is at stake in some of these with some of these issues. So Jeff is with us today. One of the key things we want to go over during this whole session is his presentation on A New Coast: Strategies for Responding to Devastating Storms and Rising Sea. Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bob. I'm going to load up a presentation here and talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we face. Hope everyone can see that okay.
I can see it, so.
All right.
Everything else probably can as well.
Well, thanks again, Bob, and thank you to American University and to the Georgetown Climate Center for holding this webinar. My plan this afternoon is to give you a quick sketch of some of the background conditions that define the problem that more severe storms and rising seas pose for the American coast. And then I want to concentrate on what we need to do to prepare for these risks, boiling it down to three big policy choices. First is whether we need a major new national program to help state and local governments manage coastal flooding and gradual permanent inundation from rising seas. Second is whether the national response to coastal flooding and rising seas should continue down the path of major investments in structural protection like seawalls, or shift toward a focus on relocation. And finally, there are critical issues related to social justice that need attention. I want to suggest some things that we can do to make solutions to coastal flooding more socially just. So climate change is altering the American coast in many ways, but the single most dramatic impact is new patterns of coastal storms, including the hurricanes that pose a particular risk to the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic coasts. Unfortunately, scientists agree that climate change is likely to cause an increase in the number of the most severe storms. The most dangerous and damaging part of coastal storms is the flooding resulting from storm surges. And more extreme storms will push sturges ashore, causing wider damage and loss of life. In addition, future major storms are expected to generate more rainfall and intensify more rapidly, making them harder to predict. The past several years have produced a string of devastating storms, and this year has been especially hard on the western Gulf of Mexico with hurricanes Laura and Sally. Here's a shot of flooding near St. Charles, Louisiana after Hurricane Laura. And here's flooding in downtown Pensacola from Hurricane Sally. But there have been coastal storms for years. They randomly strike an area, doing their damage, and then they move on, allowing rebuilding to begin. Today, there's a new factor to consider. Future storm surges will ride on top of higher sea levels, reaching further inland than ever before. Not only do rising seas bring more extensive storm surges, they occur everywhere along the coast. And worst of all, rising seas bring inundation that stays and doesn't drain away after the storm passes. So just how much sea level rise are we talking about? This graph here is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's 2017 Sea Level Rise Report. It shows a wide range, everything from a foot to 8 feet of sea level rise by 2100, based on some uncertainty about the models and the rate of warming that will occur over that time. To make a long story short, most experts agree that there's a reasonable chance of 1 to 2 feet by 2050 and 2 to 6 feet by the year 2100. Experts find less agreement on how to account for new research suggesting that ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica are unstable and could lead to significantly more rapid sea level rise. In its 2017 report, NOAA tried to account for this instability of the ice sheets with an estimate of 8 feet of sea level rise by 2100 as an extreme scenario. Here's a photo of the Pine Island Glacier, one of the larger ice sheets in Antarctica. A new study just last week reported this glacier breaking up faster than expected. And of course, sea level rise will continue significantly for several centuries after 2100. NOAA cites an intermediate scenario of 6 feet by 2150 and over 9 feet by 2200, with even an extreme estimate of almost 30 feet by 2200. So why is all of this a problem? Let's assume roughly 3 feet of sea level rise by 2100. That would inundate over 12,000 square miles of the United States that's now home to over 3.5 million people. Hundreds of communities would be inundated in whole or in part. The value of residential property lost to more severe storms and rising seas is calculated to be as high as $3 trillion by 2100, although timely implementation of adaptation measures could reduce these costs. And these costs and damage estimates are based on the population along the coast today, not the population that will be there by 2100. And coastal population in just the 100-year coastal floodplain is expected to double by 2060. Here's a photo of high tide flooding in Miami. And here's more high tide flooding in the rural community of Smith Island in Chesapeake Bay. There's growing evidence that the value of some coastal property is declining. As storms and rising seas threaten coastal property, the market is expected to become increasingly unstable, putting homeowners, communities, and mortgage holders at significant financial risk. Here's a photo showing the intensive development already in place in Palm Beach. And it suggests the threat that rising seas pose to coastal real estate values. And it's not just coastal homes and communities at risk. Beaches and wetlands will be inundated, and some will shift inland if they're not constrained by geography or by development. Here's a shot of the wetlands in the Stillwater National Wildlife Refuge outside San Diego, showing how damaging just a small increment of sea level rise could be. In addition to ecosystems, critical infrastructure ranging from transportation to water to military bases is also at risk. Here's a photo of the Norfolk Naval Station that gives you an idea of the vulnerability they have down there to storm surges and rising seas. Given the huge costs and losses in store for the coast, it seems important to ask, are we prepared and ready to adapt? Looking at both national and state and local efforts, the answer is no. The good news is that some state and local governments have assessed risks from storms and rising seas and developed response plans, and some have moved toward implementation. There is a concerted effort from government agencies and nonprofit organizations to develop the science and decision-making tools to help states and local governments define the risks and develop response strategies. But the consensus of most experts who've looked at this state and local work is that on the whole, it's commendable, but it's not enough. It's improvisational, underfunded, uncoordinated with neighboring communities and ecosystems and infrastructure. I know that sounds a bit harsh, but it's worth talking for just a second to think about what these coastal communities are really up against. Preparing for these risks is hard because the challenges are novel and there's no playbook to follow. Communities need to shift thinking about flooding as a problem that's temporary and random geographically to one that's everywhere and permanent inundation. In other words, sea level rise, not just storm flooding. There are legal consequences to response actions and constitutional takings issues. And effective planning for these risks extends beyond the normal 5 to 20-year planning horizon to more like 50 or 100 years. So faced with these challenges, most community responses so far are intended to reduce risk from storms rather than rising seas. And they are delivering structural protection such as seawalls. Some communities are using limited federal funds to buy property, and a few are considering relocating to higher ground. Unfortunately, the federal government is not doing much to improve this situation. Two major federal programs, the flood insurance and the disaster assistance programs, are doing more harm than good in some respects. Both programs are sending coastal property owners misleading, even counterproductive messages. In the case of flood insurance, the message is that it's okay to stay in risky areas. The message of the disaster program is that the federal government will come with significant funds to rebuild pretty much what was there before if you happen to get hit by a storm. Both of these programs also face social justice challenges. In the case of flood insurance, the incentive to charge actuarial rates and restore the financial integrity of the program is at odds with the need to make premiums more affordable. And in the case of disaster relief, there's clear evidence of recovery resources going disproportionately to wealthier communities. Other federal programs like Coastal Zone Management Program and some programs at the Department of Housing and Urban Development are making contributions in some places. But on the whole, the federal efforts that are going in the right direction are inadequate, and the scale of the problem is so big. These efforts are mostly uncoordinated, and they're not tuned to the critical challenges like social justice. Well, with those background conditions in mind, let's look at the three questions I mentioned earlier. Yes, we need a national strategy, and yes, it needs to lean toward relocation of coastal assets to higher ground. And yes, we need to focus directly on social justice. State and local governments can do a lot to prepare for more severe storms and rising seas, but for the country to make significant progress toward reducing loss of life and economic impacts, the federal government must expand its existing coastal management efforts and develop major new policies and programs. Why do we need a national approach to this problem to complement state and local efforts? Well, first, the science and the risks of more severe storms and rising seas, it's very compelling. And second, the impacts are huge and apply to the entire coast. It really is a national scale problem. And third, existing national programs are not a good fit for the job, and state and local governments really need help. And finally, the federal government, although it hasn't really delivered yet, it does have the capacity, the technical and the financial resources to manage and deliver an effective national response. With all that in mind, what might a major new national program look like? I have outlined a federal program framework in my book, including new leadership capacity, new policies, and funding proposals, but today I want to focus on just three key ideas. Most important, the federal government needs to provide major new grants to states to work with coastal communities to decide how to prepare for both storms and rising seas. There should be national guidance for development of these plans, and plans that are approved should be eligible for federal funding for implementation. A critical challenge is finding the right balance between helpful insight, direction, and resources without heavy-handed federal control. States and communities need to feel empowered to define responses that fit their situation while meeting basic minimums. Federal guidance should address some key questions like whether to hold the coastline in place or relocate to higher ground, how to pay for response actions using available federal and local financial resources, and how to be sure that disadvantaged populations are treated fairly. But it's not sufficient to simply help coastal communities prepare for severe storms and rising seas. A key part of a new planning effort should be leadership by federal agencies to work with states in protecting critical infrastructure assets and coastal ecosystems. In the case of infrastructure, federal agencies need to work with states to develop plans for transportation, energy, water, and defense assets. In the case of ecosystems, the Department of Interior should work to develop an atlas mapping coastal ecosystems and where they'll migrate to as sea levels rise, and then define the actions that are needed to protect these areas. And it's critical that these plans for coastal infrastructure and ecosystems be coordinated with the plans for communities, and that coastal permits are only approved if they're consistent with these plans. The old business on the agenda is for Congress to substantially revise and update both the flood insurance and disaster relief programs. As I mentioned, both programs are sending coastal property owners misleading messages. In the case of flood insurance, the new message is, should be that it's time to step back from areas at risk of permanent inundation by rising seas. To make that happen, the federal government should stop issuing flood insurance policies for new development in areas at risk of rising seas and gradually phase out insurance for property in these sea level rise risk areas over the coming decades. In the case of disaster assistance, we need a new message that federal and state governments will shift investments to better prepare for future coastal disasters driven by rising seas as much as major storms. Today, the default solution for most planning for storms and rising seas is building an engineered protection structure like a seawall. A major program, a national program, should not dictate the solutions that state and local governments should adopt, but it should encourage relocation. Why relocation? Well, here are some reasons. Relocation is most likely to reduce loss of life. It'll also help reduce national costs of repetitive losses, and it'll reduce costs of short-lived solutions such as undersized seawalls, and it'll make impacts for individuals and communities more predictable and therefore less stressful. And again, it facilitates ecosystem upland migration and it helps optimize the relocation of critical infrastructure investments. The next question, of course, is how a national strategy might be framed to lean toward relocation. A key first step is comprehensive state and local planning to engage these issues in the first place, but another key step is to require disclosure of flood and sea level rise risk at the time of sale of properties in risky coastal areas. And that'll help build awareness of risks and understanding that the clock is running on property in these risky areas. And we also need to recognize that new development in areas to be inundated by rising seas is just making future relocation a bigger challenge. We need new policies to steer new development to safer places. Ending flood insurance for new development in these areas would send that message, but we need to rethink and expand existing property buyout programs to be less about buying single damaged properties after a storm and more looking toward community scale investments that shift buildings, services, utilities together to higher ground before a disaster or storm hits. And finally, we need a major new federal investment in coastal property to help stabilize the coastal real estate market and be a financial buffer for homeowners and communities as coastal property values spiral downward. I expect that we would all agree that social justice must be central to any effort to address this challenge. But what can the federal government do to step up to the social justice challenges posed by storms and rising seas? First, well, we need to fix existing inequities in the programs that we have, including providing for affordable flood insurance premiums and equitable spending for disaster recovery funds. Another step is to develop a social justice standard for state and local response plans. And to meet the standard, states would need to engage disadvantaged communities in the planning process and treat them fairly when implementing solutions. And that plans meeting the new social justice standards, well, if the plan doesn't meet the new standard, it shouldn't be eligible for federal funding for implementation of strategies. And finally, solutions for storms and rising seas that fit the narrow geographic area are more likely to result in proposals like seawalls that protect high value property but leave lower value property unprotected. So if we push for solutions that cover larger sections of the coast, both the wealthy and disadvantaged communities, this helps avoid this cherry picking favoring wealthy areas. So in conclusion, the coast that we know today and we've known for centuries, it will not exist 100 years from now. And there's nothing we can do to change that. What we can do is manage a transition to a new coast smartly, saving lives, reducing costs, migrating ecosystems, managing major infrastructure investments. And we can design the new coast with our values in mind, values like addressing interests of rich and poor alike. There's a lot more about this challenge in my book, A New Coast. The link here is to the book is on the slide. Island Press will give you 20% off if you use the promo code COAST, C-O-A-S-T. Mark Twain remarked that wisdom is the reward you get for a lifetime of listening when you would rather have talked. So with that, I think it's time that I closed and look forward to hearing from the other panelists and your questions. Thank you.
Okay. John, thank you for that presentation. And we're going to turn, what I'm going to do now is turn us to our panelists. And there I am, I came back. Hi, John. Hi, Jeff. All right. I'm going to turn to the panelists, and I see some questions coming in, Jeff, but I think I want to get the panelists quick, reactions to your presentation, and then we can end on trying to deal with some of the questions coming in from the audience. So first up, I'm going to recognize Lisa Hamilton, who's the Adaptation Programs Director for the Georgetown Climate Center. And she's formerly the director of the Climate and Energy Program for the Center for International Environmental Law. And she has focused a lot of work on a lot of her time on how do you leverage the power of the law, and we heard a few comments on law from Jeff, to champion climate policies and protect the environment, but also to promote human rights. And so she's had a lot of experience in that arena. She's led coastal resilience issues with the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators and is a member of the Global Adaptation Resilience Working Group. Also the Climate Resilience Planning and Adaptation Project with REACT for the We Act for Environmental Justice in Harlem, New York. This whole issue of the information available to people to inform decision-making and on financial risk is also an area that Lisa has spent time looking at. So Lisa, I'm going to ask you to have some reactions to Jeff's point. I have to tell you that if you've been looking at the questions, you'll know that there's some questions in here about gentrification, Jeff, and some other things. So Lisa, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Bob. And thank you to American for giving Georgetown Climate Center the opportunity to co-sponsor this event. As Bob mentioned, my name is Lisa Ann Hamilton. I'm the Adaptation Program Director at the Georgetown Climate Center. And since 2009, the Climate Center has worked to serve as a resource for state and local governments on issues of climate change, particularly focused on communities and how they can adapt to the impacts of climate change. And I want to say, I can't say enough good things about Jeff's book. We at the Climate Center, these issues are very close to our heart. This summer we released two toolkits that bear directly on the issues that Jeff raised throughout the book. First, we issued a managed retreat toolkit. And in that toolkit are resources for state and local governments. And the idea is, as was discussed earlier, the difference between an orderly transition and a disruptive transition has everything to do with planning. And while there is no one silver bullet for what communities need to do, and there's no one size fits all approach, There's some very good case studies that are included in that managed retreat toolkit and examples of how state and local governments have begun to attack this problem and how they have grappled with not only just the structural issues as discussed with respect to infrastructure, but the emotional issues. These are people's homes, these are people's neighbors. These are in many instances the only places people have ever called home. And asking people to relocate to new areas is incredibly difficult, but that difficulty can be managed when there's planning involved. And so that resource talks a great deal about that. I also want to address our second toolkit, which was equitable adaptation. As Jeff mentioned in his book, this idea of social justice is really critical and at the core of planning efforts. And just to sort of address this question of gentrification, one of the phenomena we're seeing in Miami is this, it's called climate gentrification. You saw the images of those coastal properties that are directly on the waterfront. Many of those residences are multi-million-dollar properties, and with them come multi-million-dollar mortgages. And those were the communities that were often restricted to African Americans, communities of colors. They were redlined out, they couldn't get mortgages in those areas. And as a result, you have areas like Liberty City, further inland on higher ground, where many of those residents live. So you had the cheaper areas of Miami, primarily Black and brown. And all of a sudden, now that we're seeing sea level rise, you're seeing many of those residents displaced because higher ground now is more attractive. And the demand for housing has increased, and you're seeing residents evicted. And so how to not have disproportionate impact on low income, Black and brown people, people of color is critical. And so what Miami has done is created some bonding programs that not only address the need to invest in natural resources along the shoreline to abate some of the impacts of erosion, but it's also including elements of affordable housing. These sort of higher ground areas are called receiving areas. What are the ways in which those areas now have greater access to affordable housing, but how do you also ensure that you have rent consideration so that people aren't suddenly evicted? Are there measures that you can put into place either through local regulation or ordinances to make sure that you're protecting the interest of residents? So that's just an example of the kinds of things that we talk about in our equitable adaptation toolkit that goes directly to some of the points Jeff was making with respect to social justice. The other issue that we raised that I want to also amplify is this issue of the financial impact on municipalities. And I know I'm probably going a little bit off script here, but I can't emphasize this enough. You have so many private entities who are taking action. Private corporations, as was mentioned earlier, are beginning to realize their climate exposure is beyond their greenhouse gas emission footprint, that it has a lot to do with how can they sustain business operations in a storm, how do disruptive weather events interfere with their supply chains. You have corporations like Coca-Cola who came out and said increased drought means decreased access to water, and water is an essential element of our product, and therefore we will be in a hard position should we find access to water a scarce resource. But municipalities, on the other hand, have been less nimble, and particularly for those who have fewer resources, smaller staff, and are less sophisticated. Many also are driven by politics, where they're not preparing for climate change. The result will be higher cost of borrowing, which means trying to fund projects will be more expensive and therefore less likely to get done. So again, these are the kinds of inequities. If you're already in a position where you're disproportionately or more vulnerable, there's a very high risk that the increased incidence of climate-related weather events will continue to impact and bear on you. But I do highly, again, recommend Jeff's book. It is such a good overview. We are so excited to be able to have this wonderful resource to support, and these key principles, I'll echo them again, the importance of social justice or equitable adaptation, really the need to support state and local governments as they coordinate on these efforts, and planning. Planning is really the best way, and the difference between voluntary and prepared potential relocation, because relocation will often be an inevitable choice, versus disruption and very painful, permanent, and sudden disruption. So I'm going to include some sources in the chat that I think might be good nibbles for people who are interested in these issues. We have these online resources at the Climate Center. And again, I'm going to hold up Jeff's book here. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's well tagged. I think you will too. So again, thank you again, American, for having me. And thank you, Jeff, for your wonderful book.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. That was a good addition to the conversation. Next up is Rich Innes. Let me just say a few words about Rich. Rich staffs the work of the Joint Oceans Commission Initiative. In the last decade, there's been several major ocean commissions in the United States, and this really is important work. And it relates to ocean and coastal resiliency strongly. He also helps work on the National Estuary Program, a program I myself worked on when, as Sheldon Whitehouse mentioned earlier, as a former EPA person, I worked on the National Estuary Program, which is in many ways regional efforts that regional watershed efforts that are on the front line of some of the issues that we're talking about here today. Rich has a history of working with EPA leadership in the past, in particular working at the Meridian, as a senior fellow at Meridian, an organization to help people resolve major issues that Bill Ruckelshaus helped be the founder of, Bill being the first EPA administrator. And Rich has had a history with Mr. Ruckelshaus through his career. And he also worked at both the Environmental Protection Agency as well as the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. So I'm going to leave out no, I won't, because I'm going to say it, his Peace Corps volunteer work, but in Kenya. But Rich, give us the perspectives you have on Jeff's work. And then there's already questions coming in, but I'm holding the powder here until we get through your discussion.
Good. Thank you so much, Bob. And Bob is modest. He talked about working with the National Estuary Programs. He led the National Estuary Programs as the Assistant Administrator for Water at EPA. And hopefully we will get back to that kind of enlightened leadership at such a critical agency. So, so thank you very much. I do want to underscore something that Senator Whitehouse just touched upon. He is already established a fund called it's the National Ocean and Coastal Security Fund, which exists in law. And one of the bills that is up and actually could pass before the end of the Congress would dedicate funding from offshore wind and put it into that fund. That was one of the recommendations of both major US commissions, is that we have a dedicated fund to address the kinds of major issues that Jeff and Lisa and this whole panel have just underscored are going to be critical. I do want to quote a famous American philosopher, Stan Laurel, who said to his partner Hardy, "This is another fine mess you've gotten us into," and we are certainly in a mess. And the you in this case, however, is all of us. It is not, you can't point the finger. It'd be very convenient to point the finger at the current administration. But this predates even the current administration. They have not done anything to help, in fact, quite the opposite, by removing programs that were already decreasing the amount of carbon emissions. And I'm referring to the Clean Power Plan, which was in place at EPA, to CAFE standards, which have nothing to do with coffee. It was fuel efficiency for cars. by reversing those. We are injecting huge amounts more of carbon into the air. And this all comes down to exacerbating the problem that we are dealing with and that Jeff very eloquently and thoroughly deals with in his book. I'm going to hold up another prop. Very few people get the actual paper itself these days, but this is the New York Times today. And the headline says, "A climate crossroads with two paths, merely bad or truly horrific." Those are the choices that we're left with. We're already left with them. It doesn't matter even if we have a new administration that on Inauguration Day reaffirms the Paris Accords, which the United States led on. We were the ones who really helped to put those accords together. And of course, the current administration has signaled its intent to remove us from that the day after Inauguration Day. Just by coincidence, happens to be that time period. So, but even if we do that, and even if we reassert US leadership on a global scale, we are still in, as so poignantly pointed out in this work, for decades of dealing with these critical issues. Bill Ruckelshaus, who Bob mentioned, first and then the fifth administrator of EPA, he said he was definitely never come back for a third time, but he had developed a way of explaining this. He called it chronological NIMBY. NIMBY is an acronym for not in my backyard. And we don't want to deal with problems that are not in our backyard. If it's someone else's backyard, if we're exporting problems to other countries. But chronological NIMBY is that dealing with climate change doesn't, that the cost of that are going to be borne by our generation right now, and we won't realize the true benefits of it for years to come. So it's this sort of idea of, well, it's not on my watch. We are seeing a reversal of that, of Bill's theory, is we're seeing it right now with climate impacts on our coasts, and that are brought out. I'm also going to hold up Jeff's book here. One more plug here, Jeff. But it is laid out in there. We are dealing with it now, and if we don't get a handle on it, we're going to pay an even more dear price in terms of human life, human suffering, and dislocation, and not leaving this planet a better place than we found it. I'm going to stop there. I do want to just say that the National Estuary Programs are one of those bodies that Jeff referred to that have developed comprehensive plans that, along with other state plans, and Lisa made a very good point at the very end about planning being so essential to solving this problem. We have very good plans that are in place. We need money and we need political will in order to implement them. November 3rd is coming up. Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter. We need to elect visionary leaders who have the courage to address these problems. I'm going to stop there, and I know there are a number of great questions that are coming in. I'm looking at them. Thank you, Bob.
Okay, Lisa and Rich, thank you so much for those additional observations and reactions to Jeff's presentation and his book. You both appropriately held the book up. And Jeff, you should be thankful for that. So there's a number of questions in. I've been trying to keep track of them here a little bit. Let me phrase some of them here a little bit. There was a couple of questions, one in particular from Brendan Doyle, who's, Jeff, a lot of the conversation was about 2100 and 2200. And I think Brendan's question is, so what do we think might be happening in the next decade, or let's say the next several decades, like in the near term, in terms of potential displacement? Have you thought through that? These issues, the effects are happening now. Do we see some displacement starting to happen?
So yes, we are seeing displacement occurring already. One of the metrics that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration uses to understand how the coasts are changing is a measure of the frequency of the very high tide floodings. I showed a picture of downtown Miami and Smith Island with high tide flooding. We're already seeing that today. And it's predicted that it's going to occur, these high tide events where water comes into the street are going to occur increasingly more often during any given year. So one community might see that flooding only once a month at the very highest of the high tide. And over 10 years, though, it might be 2 or 3 times a month that high tide flooding is occurring. So that's gradually weakening the infrastructure. It's creating more disruption in the area in which the flooding occurs. Can't drive through it, can't get to a business. Sometimes public transportation is interrupted. The initial impacts are going to be the inconveniences of the occasional exceptionally high flooding that you might have seen 10 years ago, but only very rarely. Now it's going to be much more frequent during a given month or a given year.
Lisa or Rich, any thoughts on this?
I just want to agree that that's right. I mean, it's just anecdotally, we're looking at situations that have never occurred before. I mean, the historical, somebody just made a comment in our circles the other day that the historical FEMA flood maps are not relevant to what we're going to see in the future, because what we're encountering is so unprecedented. And there are just instances. I had one colleague tell me she grew up in California from 1 to 20 years of age, never had to relocate. In the time she's been away, her parents have had to relocate or flee, evacuate a fire instance 3 times in the last 5 years. And there's certain realities that are becoming recurring. And I think, again, planning is critical in being able to acknowledge and recognize this. And to the extent that the national programs that Jeff mentioned, particularly for our coasts, where we cannot continue to support programs that are not only fiscally irresponsible, National Flood Insurance Program experiencing year after year repeated billions of dollars in debt. It simply is not fiscally sustainable. But they're reinforcing the wrong message. To continue to rebuild in harm's way is not a good use of fiscal resources. It does not benefit the families as difficult as having to leave a selected area, but it's a risk to essential infrastructure, and to continue to reinforce what we know is not going to be working in the same way 20 years from now is just not effective policy or strategy.
I would just encourage everybody, and it's already been mentioned, but if you go onto the NOAA's website, where you factor and you choose your own variable. So you can say sea level rise is going to be 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot. You put that in, those assumptions, and then you plug in your zip code. This is very easy. It's very interactive. Put in your zip code of either the places where you live, work, where you go to recreate, the beaches that you go to, and it will show you slices of the coast disappearing over time. And it is it's a sobering and riveting exercise, and it's something that directly affects over half the population of the United States, but really affects all of us. And I just think this is real. This is real.
Yeah, Lisa brought up an important point about future versus the past. And most of the work on flooding, whether it's coastal flooding or riverine flooding, and again, all of these things are going to be impacted. In fact, we often have heavy rains at the same time we're having tidal push or tidal surging, which then backs it up even more. The riverine flooding merging with the marine flooding or tidal flooding. But when planners, and I used to be one, look at design and land use issues, we would, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we would look at the historic record of events, of hydrology and meteorology. We would look at, and then we would come up with this thing, well, with the frequency, this will happen once every 100 years. It doesn't mean that there isn't a % chance it can happen a year, but on average, it won't happen for 100 years. The meteorological and hydrologic record going forward is going to be completely different. And so what may have been every 100-year type of frequency in the past may now be a 5-year frequency in the future, or a 10-year frequency. And I think that's a really important point, because and Jeff, you make this in the book, the status quo is not reality anymore. There's a new reality that is evolving in front of us. But I want to get back to, because there are a number of questions related to this, back to the relocation and the flood insurance issues. Lisa, I think you covered some of the gentrification type of, equity issues, but still we have such a wealth disparity in coastal areas. We have some exceedingly, expensive real estate on coast, and then we have very vulnerable areas on the coast, and we've seen this in some of the hurricanes just recently that you've pointed out. Jeff, I think that, to me, there was a little bit of a paradox. If we want to phase out the flood insurance program, yet the people who can afford to live these places without flood insurance will still be there. And so talk a little bit more, all of you, about the relocation issue and how that really over time, not the displacement, but the actual forward thinking, let's change the land use here. Jeff, you start.
So yeah, I can jump in on that. So, I think it's important to say right up front that the flood insurance program has a long history and has done a lot of good over many years in terms of reducing flood risks. Sea level rise is a curve, though, and makes the whole sort of equation of the flood insurance program unstable. When the land where a house is located becomes permanently inundated, as opposed to flooded every 100 years or flooded every 50 years, when it's only happening occasionally, you can make an insurance model work. When it's permanent inundation, that's a totally different problem. And that's why relocation has to be part of the equation. So the first thing, and I said it earlier, but just to restate it quickly, is that it's really important that the new development that's occurring, we need to be steering it away from these places that will be inundated. And so if we could steer it away by discouraging developers from building there, for instance, by not offering flood insurance to build new development in those risky areas, that would be a good thing. But that doesn't solve, of course, the problem Bob mentioned of, well, you have lots of people who are already there. And so the first thing I think you need to do is really be honest with people up front about the risks that they're running. When you run a program like the Federal Flood Insurance Program, you need to recognize when it becomes a moral hazard. If you're encouraging people through subsidies to stay in a place that you know is going to be flooded, perhaps in 20, 30, or 40 years, that is a moral hazard, and it needs to be reckoned with. So one thing that can be done is simply say, well, understand that you're at risk here, and in the long term, you need to be someplace safer. So my suggestion about phasing out the flood insurance program just in those areas that are subject to permanent inundation is that it be over a 30-year period. And 30 years because most people's financial expectation, their mortgage for the property, even if we started with a fresh project today, would terminate within 30 years. So to some extent, we're trying to account for that. The other thing is, I've suggested in the book that there is a real risk to the coastal communities, the homeowners, but also the larger national economy of the mortgages for these at-risk coastal properties becoming untenable, unstable, and essentially defaulting. And so we need to be really cautious about that and do what we can to avoid it, not just to help the individual homeowner, but to help the broader community and the national economy. And to do that, we need an investment from the federal government in helping people transition away from these risky properties. Rather than giving them low-cost flood insurance to stay where they are, we need to be offering to help them relocate to a safer, higher ground. And that might be simply by purchasing their home, allowing them to stay while it's still safe to stay there by purchasing well ahead of the flood. And for those communities which are lower income, a state or the federal government might decide that we want to make those communities a higher priority for the available funds that we have for this kind of collective buyout process.
Okay, quickly, anything else, Lisa or Rich? I want to get a couple of more questions in before our hour is up, or our time is up, which is up in about 8 minutes.
Sure. Just very quickly, I again want to highlight one of our resources. In our Managed Retreat Toolkit, we include case studies, and one of them is a summary of the Keno Indian Nation in Washington State. And they went through a process of managed retreat. They planned ahead of time. They worked with developers. There was even some job training and programs for members of the community. We are big advocates of community engagement as being at the very beginning and at each and every stage of a planning process. So there are case studies on the Managed Retreat Toolkit. Then I included that link in the chat that really talk about what does a master plan look like? What are the elements that need to be in place that address the different legal and policy challenges of moving communities, and when it's done in stages, and how to keep the community engaged in the long run. But somebody asked in the Q&A about, yes, they're disparate about how to make relocation affordable. And what we've seen so far, and again, no one size fits all, the role of nonprofit organizations and community development groups and foundations have been really pivotal in supporting in not only community engagement, community outreach, but in resources and support to begin to engage these issues. And I think that as there is a greater awareness on the importance of equitable adaptation and recognizing that wealthier community families, individuals have more options than low-income individuals do, is that our hope is that planning initiatives will prioritize the needs of those most likely to be negatively impacted, and starting with fewer resources as being built into what an effective plan looks like. Right now, it's not perfect, and there's a lot of little haphazard pieces, but those where there is state and local money, that's usually supported by foundation and nonprofit organizations supporting those efforts. So,
and thank you, Lisa. Bob, I'll just mention quickly, this is one ray of hope. There is a bill, the Water Resources Development Act, which may pass in this Congress, that shifts the Corps of Engineers from what hard or gray infrastructure and makes it very viable for them to be using green infrastructure, living shorelines, mangroves, swamps that can slow down these storms and protect these communities. It also reauthorizes the National Estuary Program. So anyway, there is some hope. We have to hit on so many cylinders, but these pieces of legislation are one of them.
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Rich. One of the questions is nature-based solutions, which we didn't really talk much about, but you've just brought it up that there's legislation look at it. Obviously, that's an important part of mitigating the intensity of storms for sure. It's not going to eventually stop the full sea level rise, but it's certainly going to mitigate the impact and the energy of a storm. But you know, coastal dunes and berms can all, you know, that are vegetated can also provide a more a non-structural barrier, but sort of in between structural and that was definitely one of the questions I'm glad we touched on a little bit here. The last question that is the last question I'd like you guys to talk about, and we really have 4 minutes here, is that, and there's been some discussion about the role of Congress, even if the agencies aren't functioning. And, you know, it could be the other way, the agencies might function and Congress doesn't. But, you know, I know that in the House of Representatives Committee on the Climate Crisis, they put out a staff report, and it had a whole section in it on resilience, Jeff, that had a lot of the ideas, I think it's in your book, about how the federal government could be better organized. You guys might want to talk a little bit about the congressional role, and then we'll finish up here. Jeff.
Sure. So I'll start real quick. I was very encouraged to hear Senator Whitehouse optimistic about a new Congress and a new approach, not just to managing greenhouse gases, but actually coping with the resilience challenges that we're facing. And with the ideas that are perking now as a result of the Climate Crisis Committee and other committees in Congress, I think we're going to see a lot of great ideas come forward. And I think early next year will be a very exciting time for developing the legislative solutions that can really help move us forward, including help state and local governments tackle these difficult problems.
All right, and Rich and Lisa, any particular points?
I was encouraged and very much agree with Senator Whitehouse's assessment that if there is a change in administration, especially if there's a change in the Senate, there are a number of bills that could form a nucleus for the first time a truly serious consideration of climate change and how we address it. Cory Booker put in a bill, $55 billion, which has a huge section in it on coastal resilience. But there are others as well. So I'm encouraged by that. We need to make this election count.
Lisa, 30 seconds if you want to add one more point.
This election really, truly is the difference between whether, to Rich's earlier quote, whether things will be merely bad or horrific and we experience an unnecessary loss of life. And I hate to put it in such dire ways, but we have such fundamentally different perspectives politically in this country about how climate change needs to be prioritized and what we do to address it now. And unfortunately, that partisanship, there are a few good people on both on the Republican side who are more amenable to these ideas, but we've got to ensure that your vote is aligned with your values. If you care about climate change, ensure that your candidates do too.
John, I'm turning it back to you to put this to bed. Thank you.
Thank
John.
you.
Great presentations.
Thank you. Terrific panel. Just absolutely terrific. I hope I'm back live. Can you all see me? Good. Thank you to the audience. We had a very active audience with a lot of questions. Sorry we couldn't get to everybody. I wanted to let you all know that this is part of a series, Climate Change in Communities, Lessons from the World's Most Vulnerable. So we will have sort of an international tilt to many of the remaining webinars, and these are spread out over the fall and into the winter. Also, next week, the Center for Environmental Policy is hosting with the American Lung Association a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Clean Air Act. And we have Gina McCarthy, Carol Browner, Bill Riley, all former EPA administrators, Tommy Wells, who's the current head of Energy and Environment for the District of Columbia, and a really amazing lineup of experts and leaders in the environment for that event next week on the 29th at noon. You will probably get an email. If you registered for this event, you will get an email as well. If you want to see the schedule of all these events, put in your browser AU space Center for Environmental Policy, and you should find it. And with that, thank you to our panelists. What a great job. And thank you to our audience. Have a good evening.